So, meine Damen und Herren, ich hoffe, Sie verstehen mich. Meine Stimme ist etwas, um es vorsichtig zu formulieren, angeschlagen. Ich darf Sie ganz herzlich im Hamburger Institut für Sozialforschung begrüßen für einen Event, der für uns auch neu ist, nämlich eine Preisverleihung an den hier sitzenden Soziologen Michael Mann. Wir sind alle ziemlich aufgeregt, wie dies so sein wird, wie das werden wird. Ich sage Ihnen gleich etwas zum Ablauf. Zunächst wird sprechen Jan-Philipp Reemtsma, den ich glaube ich hier nicht vorstellen muss, Literaturwissenschaftler, Sozialwissenschaftler, Gründer dieses Instituts und langjähriger Leiter dieses Instituts. Danach wird es eine Laudatio von mir geben und danach wird Michael Mann sprechen, um jetzt keine Kulturclash-Dinge aufkommen zu lassen. Wir beginnen ganz kurz mit Deutsch und wechseln dann ganz schnell ins Englische über. Ja, also auch dem Gast zu Ehren natürlich. Ja. Und ich bitte jetzt gleich darum, Jan-Philipp Reemtsma etwas zum heutigen Abend zu sagen.
Meine Damen und Herren, dear Michael Mann, welcome to the Hamburg Institute. Congratulations for achieving the Landshut Award. This is the first time the Hamburg Institute for Social Research awards this prize, so a tradition as significant, I have no doubt, starts with your name. I'm very glad a better choice the Institute could not make. Als ich vor vielen Jahren dieses Institut gegründet habe, mir geht solche selbsthistorisierende Formulierung noch immer nicht leicht von den Lippen, überlegte ich auch eine Weile, ob das Institut seinen Anfang als eine Institution, die nicht nur Forschungen betreibt, Forschungen fördert und eine Menge anderes macht, was das Institut von Anfang an getan hat und weiter tut, Verlag und Zeitschrift kamen später, auch etwas machen sollte, wie einen Preis zu vergeben. Mit einer Preisvergabe tut ein Institut zweierlei. Einmal, es bringt den eigenen Namen mit einer gewissen Ambition ins öffentliche Spiel. Und zweitens, wenn es dem Preis nicht den eigenen Namen, was ja möglich wäre, sondern einen anderen gibt, bekennt es sich zu einer Persönlichkeit und deren intellektuellem Werk und markiert den Ausgangspunkt einer Reihe, einer Tradition, wenn etwas daraus wird. Es hatte einen Reiz, das zu tun, aber es war zu früh. Zu Beginn der Institutstätigkeit wäre es bloße Ambition gewesen, Ambition ohne Basis. Später, als man sagen konnte, dass sich das Institut die Basis und seinen Namen geschaffen hatte, kam mir der Gedanke immer mal wieder, aber ich schob ihn auf, besser zu anderer Zeit, zu anderer Gelegenheit. Nun habe ich vor 3 Jahren die Leitung des Hauses an Wolfgang Knöbel übergeben und nun hatte er die Idee und ich stimme ihm zu. Jetzt ist der richtige Moment. Das Institut hat durch die Zeit seiner Existenz, durch die Fülle dessen, was es getan, was in ihm gedacht, was es publiziert hat, welche Personen in ihm gearbeitet haben und nun an anderen bedeutenden Institutionen dieses Landes oder anderswo arbeiten, welche Personen neu zu ihm gestoßen sind, längst seine eigene Tradition begründet und es kann nun mit der Stiftung eines Preises, der im Laufe der Zeit, ich wiederhole es, eine eigene Tradition begründen wird, ein weiteres Zeichen setzen. Den Preis nach Siegfried Landshut zu benennen, war eine gute Idee. Landshut lehrte in Hamburg nach einer schwierigen Zeit des Exils. Er war Soziologe und Politikwissenschaftler, er gehörte zu den Begründern dieser Disziplin in Deutschland. In seiner zurückgezogenen Habilitationsschrift betonte er die Wichtigkeit der Selbsthistorisierung der Soziologie. Diese Schrift, zu großen Teilen eine Auseinandersetzung mit Max Weber, ist innerlich angetrieben durch den Impetus des Marxschen Frühwerks, das er später, lange vor dem entsprechenden Band in den MEW, edierte. Menschen meiner Generation, die einen intellektuellen Weg eingeschlagen haben, der sie in Philosophie oder Gesellschaftswissenschaften führten, sind mit dieser Edition nahezu aufgewachsen. Es wird nun regelmäßig Vorträge geben, die unter dem Namen Landshut stehen, Landshut Lectures, wie sie internationalisierend heißen, und es gibt eben den Landshut-Preis. Der Preisträger benennt 2 Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler, die einen kurzen Forschungsaufenthalt in Deutschland, vorzüglich am Institut, erhalten. Der erste Preisträger nun, ich sagte, es ist Michael Mann, ich gratuliere ihm und ich gratuliere dem Institut zu dieser Wahl. Michael Mann's sociological works on the issue power is internationally well received, so is his book on ethnical cleansing, The Dark Side of Democracy, which is published in the Institute's Hamburger Edition. The Dark Side of Democracy is one of the books which expound what Horkheimer Adorno in the Dialectic of Enlightenment tried to fix in a very abstract way, close to historical empiricism. That the process of modernization in its different moments we understand as progress, and are right to do so, rationalization, reducing violence, improving democracy and public participation, can also produce a great destructive potential, even the potential and reality of mass destruction. But now I pass the floor to the director of the Institute for some more detailed laudatory words. Thank you very much.
How to become a historical sociologist? This is a question difficult to answer. Maybe one could argue that studying history at a prominent academic institution, as Michael Mann did when he made his BA at Oxford University, is a kind of precondition. And of course, it could also help to acquire some knowledge in sociology, as was the case with Michael Mann when he did his PhD, again in Oxford, in the early 1970s. But many promising young students and scholars studied history in the 1960s and 1970s, and quite a few of them even turned towards sociology. Yet, historical sociologists have been a rare species at that time. The disciplines of history and sociology seemingly didn't fit each other, even if some of the founding fathers of sociology, such as Max Weber, had been at least as much sociologists and economists as historians. Thus again, how to become a historical sociologist? I certainly will not be able to answer this question tonight, but I dare to say that, apart from having degrees, both in history and sociology, it might help a lot of being interested in social classes and of being British. Indeed, when Michael Mann started his academic career in the 1970s, he was very much concerned with class analysis. His PhD dissertation, Workers on the Move, was an empirical study of a geographical relocation of a food factory and the attitudes of workers in this very relocation process. In more general terms, the working class, its consciousness and actions in Western Europe were at the center of Mann's publications during the 1970s. But that alone didn't make him very special, because many at that time dealt with similar topics, particularly Marxists and other leftists, who in an oftentimes enormously sterile and dogmatic way tried to theorize again and again why the working class didn't do the thing it was supposed to do, making a revolution. Michael Mann's way of sociological reasoning was different, although with many sympathies for the political left himself. He never was in danger of getting lost in the labyrinth of exegesis of the works of Karl Marx and other Marxists. With great sovereignty, he was able to screen the supply of sociological theories and on class and class consciousness and to evaluate that what was useful and what was simply wrong. As he argued, neither was it to be assumed that the workers would integrate smoothly into modern Western societies, nor could a revolutionary role of the working class be expected, which at present, as many Marxists tended to claim in the 1960s and 70s, would be hindered only by a false class consciousness. According to Mann, the diagnosis of a crisis of legitimacy in the political system of Western democratic systems was simply misleading. Societies, as he put it in a theoretical way, are not homogeneous and clearly structured entities, but rather agglomerations of different conflicts which only under highly improbable conditions will lead to a revolutionary climax. These conditions are not there, however, which also means that any talk of a revolution due to a crisis of legitimacy is simply bad sociology. Even today's readers will feel and admire the soothing, very British sobriety and calmness of the arguments to be detected in Michael Mann's texts of that time. These articles and books, written predominantly at Essex University, where Michael Mann was a lecturer between 1971 and 1977, stand out positively from the widespread crisis rhetoric of many contemporaries in the social sciences and has received subsequent empirical confirmation. Western societies were not on the verge of collapse in the 1960s and 70s, and Michael Mann offered many good reasons for such a fact. In 1977, Mann became reader at the London School of Economics, and probably it was this intellectual environment which was decisive for his future career, not the least because it was there where he prepared for the first volume of his famous The Sources of Social Power, which was published in 1986 and which made immediately him famous as protagonist of a theoretically highly ambitious historical sociology. It was at the LSE where he came into closer contact with authors such as Ernest Gellner, John A. Hall, and Anthony Giddens, all of them scholars who have been working at this point of their career on basic problems of the social sciences and the interrelationship between history, anthropology, and sociology. Between 1977 and 1986, Mann published some tremendously important and famous essays in which he tried to get away from a couple of seemingly self-evident assumptions of sociology in particular and the social sciences in general. First, as he made clear, and the following became the theoretical core of the Sources of Social Power, sociology has to theorize much more than in the past the topic of the state, both ancient and modern states. Neither Parsonian functionalists nor Marxist sociologists have given political power its due weight in the analysis of social processes. The power of the bureaucracy and this is crucial, above all the power of the military have been widely neglected within the social sciences, so that sociology has to bring back both the state and the military in the sphere of sociological theorizing. This was Michael Mann's decisive move in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the time of the Chinese conflict with Vietnam, in the period of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, in the era of the NATO double-track decision, and the rallies against the stationing of the Pershing II missiles in Germany. Some of you might remember these events and ask, what is so surprising that the social scientist theorizes war and conflict in times of war and conflict? The answer is, Michael Mann did it, and by doing so he was almost alone, certainly not in company with the majority of social scientists and sociologists in Western Europe. Just think about the leading figures within German sociology at that time, be it Niklas Luhmann or Jürgen Habermas. They hardly ever wrote about war and conflict in a systematic way and they certainly would have refuted the claim that war and the military are relevant topics for social theorists. Second, in writing these articles, Mann did not only distinguish between ideological and economic power, between military and political power. This became his famous IEMP model, I for ideology, E for economics, M for military, and P for political power. He also quite decidedly dismissed the concept of society as a fundamental concept of sociology. As he made clear, and as he has already cautiously pointed out in his earlier analysis on the status of the working classes in Western Europe, pre-modern political entities, empires, kingdoms, etc., have never been units with sharp boundaries, but at most complicated and overlapping agglomerations of ideological, economic, military, and political power networks whose geographic reach-out was often very different. Only the modern nation-state managed to harmonize at least the ideological, political, and military networks, and at least partially succeeded in limiting them to its territory. Only through the nation-state in the 19th century did something like society emerge. A historical result, however, that does not necessarily have to endure in the future. As Mann demonstrated, social phenomena have always been messy. Societies as well-ordered entities have rarely ever existed. With this argument, Mann also opened up a perspective for an empirically fruitful discussion of globalization, in which he will participate actively from the mid-1990s onwards. Or to put it differently, in some sense, Mann's IEMP model was far ahead of its time because it offered sociology a perspective which became fashionable only much later by the so-called spatial turn. The spatial caging of populations and the beginning of state and empire building in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt due to geographical peculiarities, as analyzed by Mann, demonstrated in a most vivid manner the importance of space in the production of social order. One should add that Mann's influential distinction between despotic and infrastructural power is also based on this distinction, on this spatial logic, because infrastructural power is above all dependent on technological tools designed to control larger areas. And last but not least, this very special perspective allowed Mann to get away from the often naive and anachronistic use of the term society, which always evokes the picture of a unified and homogeneous modern nation-state. And the third point, as has already been hinted at, Mann was socialized in the tradition of British Weberian Marxism, and thus had a keen interest in questions of class and political power. On the one hand, Weber and Marx meant that Mann was not prepared at all to accept a Parsonian reading of Weber's work, and thus to overemphasize the role of ideas and values, something which was so prominent within non-Marxist German sociology of the 1960s and 70s. Just read the text by Wolfgang Schluchter and Jürgen Habermas on rationalization. On the contrary, Mann's focus has always been on the, as one might call it, material hardware of social order, and thus on real interests which keep such orders alive. But Marx and Weber also meant that Mann refused to accept the economic determinism which was so prevalent in the Marxian debates of the 1970s, where social phenomena were often exclusively interpreted as dependent on economic relationships. Thus, Mann tried to follow a line which he himself once described as organizational materialism. Mann, for example, was certainly interested in belief systems and ideas. The I in his famous IEMP model stands for ideology, as I already said. But Mann's method of analysis didn't primarily focus on the peculiarities of ideas, their form, their contested nature, and their change. He was much more interested in ideas as tools for organizing people and for making them act collectively. the dizzy heights of intellectual and cultural history were not his métier. As already indicated, these have been the three moves that became the premises of The Sources of Social Power. The first volume was published in 1986, and it covered the period, quote, from the beginning to AD 1760. Thus, a world history of power encompassing the time between the Mesopotamic empires to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in England. What made this book so exciting was not just the huge ambitions associated with such a project, but the way how Mann tackled his self-imposed task. Using his previously developed theory of power, the IMP model, he was able to show how ancient civilizations and empires were formed and shaped, how and why these rather heterogeneous empires declined, and why long and winding ways created a power drift which finally reached Central and Western Europe from Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and Egypt through Greece and Rome, thus enabling the so-called rise of the West, so often described in the historical and sociological literature. What made this work so convincing was, moreover, the elegance with which Mann evaded all the hazards that are naturally always associated with such a gigantic project. Mann's explanation of this power drift was not based on philosophical speculation. On the contrary, he supplied precise sociological chapters on the changing form of power configurations that, in the end, drifted towards a specific power container called the absolutist state in Europe. But Mann is a long way from singing the praise of Europe and asserting the possibly evolutionary inevitability of its rise. Again and again he shows how contingent turns, not the least the ones often related to the unpredictable outcome of wars, led to a power shift and drift that ultimately favored Europe. It could also have happened differently, however. Publishing The Sources of Social Power, Volume 1, made Mann immediately famous. He was immediately acknowledged as one of the leading historical sociologists worldwide. In 1987, he moved to Los Angeles in order to teach and work at the UCLA, and here he was preparing for the second volume, which was keenly awaited by the sociological public. It took him 7 years until The Sources of Social Power, Volume 2, The Rise of Classes and Nation-States, 1760 to 1914 were published in 1993. And the high expectations were not disappointed. On the contrary, Mann not only succeeded in amassing an enormous amount of material, he also gave a powerful sociological explanation of the outbreak of World War I in 1914, an account which still thrills the readers of this book today. In this volume, Mann mainly focuses on 5 European countries, Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, and the US. He convincingly shows, by using both quantitative and qualitative data, how and by what means the different capacities of the states increased, how peasants, workers, and rising middle classes in the nations under consideration have grouped into specific political cultural formations, and how the combination of nationalist currents and claims to power have caused the first catastrophe of the 20th century. Mann demonstrates, in a way no one did before, how the state itself has shaped class formation. That is, how the emergence of centralized state structures had a growing impact via taxes, military conscription, etc., on individuals and groups. As a result, the state became the most important focus of demands of these actors who had to organize in order to defend their interests. Thus, according to Mann, it was not the economy which produced classes. The economy produced inequality, to be sure, but it needed the state in order to create the preconditions for class action. After the publication of Volume 2 of The Sources, Mann entered the globalization debate with remarkably concise articles and essays using arguments which had in fact nothing in common with the German sociological and political science discourse in Europe at that time, in which the participants loved to talk about governance and in fact strongly believed in a smooth process of Europeanization and globalization. Writing articles such as "Nation States in Europe and Other Continents," "Has Globalization Ended the Rise of the Nation State?" and "Is There a Society Called Euro?" he was able to establish himself as one of the finest critics of those theorists, whether of a liberal or a Marxist provenance, who had all too quickly begun to the swan song to the nation state. If you are not a social scientist, and if you don't have the time to read Mann's usually rather thick books, take the time to have a glance on these rather small essays, because after more than 20 years, they have not lost any of their relevance. During the 1990s, Mann, of course, also prepared for his third volume of The Sources of Social Power, but the public waited in vain, at least for a rather long time. Volume 3 and 4 didn't come, but one could hardly call it a disappointment, because Mann, and this was obviously a surprise for many observers, began to publish a whole series of books in a very short time. Books that were obviously related to the future volumes 3 and 4 of The Sources, but books whose topics were too big and too important to be tackled within his world history of power. Incoherent Empire, published in 2003, in German Die ohnmächtige Supermacht, published at Campus Verlag, and I'm glad that Adalbert Hepp is here in the audience, who was also responsible for the first translation, actually, of The Sources of Social Power into German. It was a funny story, but we can talk about it afterwards. Incoherent Empire was published in German as Die ohnmächtige Supermacht, was a scholarly and politically masterful intervention in the then rising debate on the American empire. Only 1 year later, in 2004, Fascists was published, a book on fascist movements and fascist politicians, in which Mann asked why only two fascist movements, namely the German and the Italian one, succeeded in coming to power, whereas similar movements in many other parts of Europe failed. And again, only 1 year later, in 2005, The Dark Side of Democracy, Explaining Ethnic Cleansing, was published. And the German translation, as was already hinted at by Jan-Philipp Reemtsma, appeared here at the Hamburger Edition. And this book again showed that for Michael Mann, there are almost no geographical and historical limits in analyzing social processes. Whereas fascists have focused mostly on Europe, The Dark Side of Democracy analyzed genocides and crimes of ethnic cleansing all over the world. From the Armenian genocide, the annihilation of the so-called kulaks in Stalin's USSR, and the extermination of the European Jews by the Germans in the first part of the 20th century, to the genocidal dynamics in Indonesia, ex-Yugoslavia, and Rwanda in the second half. And it was a disturbing question Michael Mann dared to ask. Is there a relationship between democracy, the search for equal representation and self-determination on the one side, and the attempt to attain these democratic goals by homogenizing the population? Is there, to recall the title, a dark side of democracy we usually are too quick to overlook? After the publication of these three books, which add up to far more than 1,300 pages, Michael Mann obviously needed some time to recover for the next big move in his career as one of the most prolific sociological authors of our time. But this move indeed happened, and it happened spectacularly. In 2012 and 2013, almost 20 years after the publication of the first volume of The Sources of Social Power, the whole project came to an end. With only a few months, The Sources of Social Power Volume 3, Global Empires and Revolution, 1890 to 1945, and Volume 4, Globalizations, 1945 to 2011, were published, so that Mann succeeded in bringing to an end a project that most of his colleagues would have called insane if they had known the dimensions that it would take on when it all began in 1986. Trying to cover more than 4,000 years of world history in more than 2,000 pages might really sound odd. But just pick out, by accident, only 1 or 2 chapters of the many to be found in the 4 volumes, and you will realize the enormous synthetic power of sociological analysis there is in each and every chapter. You can put it this way. Writing world history might certainly not be easy, but doing so in a theoretically meaningful way is incredibly difficult, and it needed the skills of Michael Mann in order to achieve what he did. Michael Mann has not finished his mission. Tonight and on Tuesday evening, he will present us parts of the things he's working on right now. And we are all sure that the arguments he will bring forward will be as brilliant as those he made in the last 30 or 40 years. It is this brilliance, his interdisciplinary approach, his courage to tackle fundamental questions at the very heart of the social sciences, and his ambition also to intervene as a political scholar in current political or scientific controversies, which puts Michael Mann into a research tradition we are associating with the life and work of Siegfried Landshut. Thus, the scholars here at the HIS have decided that the Siegfried Landshut Prize should be awarded in 2018 to Professor Michael Mann. You don't have to carry that during your lecture. Thank you very much. So before you will start with your lecture, Lars Döpking will say a few words about the specialities of the prize.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We wanted to give our winners a chance to support young scholars with promising and interesting projects on their way to a more international career. So we asked Professor Mann to name 2 colleagues within the social science in the scope of his work who would be invited and funded to come to Hamburg as research fellows for 1 month. These will be our guests for 2019. Our first guest will be Marie E. Berry. She is assistant professor at Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver and director of the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative. As a political sociologist, she focuses on the political and social consequences of armed conflict, especially with regard to gender relations. She received her PhD at the UCLA with a vast qualitative study in Rwanda and Bosnia. In a recently published first book, War, Women and Power, From Violence to Mobilization in Rwanda and Bosnia-Herzegovina, at Cambridge University Press, she draws on her findings and investigates the relations between violence and women's political mobilization and agency. In her current project, Women's Rights After War, she investigated how political empowerment and mobilization of women after war can use instrumentally by the new regimes to consolidate their political control. In her second current project, Measuring the Microdynamics of Women's Mobilization, Marie Berry aims at a fine-grained, gender disaggregated analysis on who participates in mass protests events around the world to better understand how gender shapes the trajectories and success of these movements. Our second guest on the right will be Christopher M. Rea. He is postdoctoral research associate at the Institute for Environment and Society at Brown University and assistant professor at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at the Ohio State University. He also received his PhD at UCLA, and his research explores, among other things, the political dynamics of market economies, environmental politics, and the politics and production of scientific knowledge. Right now, he's working on his book project, Economy and Ecology, Environmental Protection and Institutional Emergence in the United States and Germany, which draws on its former empirical research over here and in the United States. On behalf of the scientific staff of the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, I would like to say that we are looking forward to have them here and to discuss their promising and challenging projects with them. Thank you a lot.
Well, I want to thank the Institute for the honor of receiving this prize, and I want to thank the words of praise, which I'm going to be asked to live up to now, which may be beyond me. I'm not giving a talk on the most general aspects of the sources of social power. I'm giving a very specific talk on war and whether wars have declined in human history or whether they are likely to decline in the near future. Now, what do I do here to get started? Maybe it's that. Yeah, but yeah.
I'm a sociologist.
Go on. There we go. That's right. Now you can see from this that through the late 18th and the 19th century, virtually all social theorists thought that society was becoming more pacific and that wars were declining or would shortly decline. For Kant, it wasn't an empirical statement, it was a hopeful statement. But it was reality for all those other names there, that there was a shift from relatively warlike societies to far more pacific ones due to a variety of different forms of modern social structure. It might be the rise of industrial society, as it was for Saint-Simon. It might be capitalism, as it was for Marx. It might be the market, or it might be democracy. And all of those people were writing in the context of the post-Napoleonic period, whereby judiciously ignoring colonial wars, they could say that war in Europe, or war in general, was declining. Now, obviously, the 20th century produced problems for that, and I have to say that there were a number of exceptions, especially in Germany at the beginning of the 20th century, of people who did not expect war to decline, people like Max Weber, Scheler, and others. In fact, at moments, they all approved of World War I. Then we had the response to World War I, which was that people, and especially sociologists, preferred to turn to more pacific topics. And so there was increasingly a neglect of war, and the same thing happened after 1945, where sociology neglected war, and what had been very promising sociology during World War II got narrowed down to being about the army as a professional organization. Of course, Marxists talked a lot about class struggle, but that was only a metaphor. It didn't mean class war. They didn't expect class war in general. And then came the Cold War, which was usually fought through proxies rather than one's own troops. And indeed, at the end of the Cold War, we have a revival of liberal optimism, especially in the United States. John Mueller, Azar Gat, who was actually Israeli, and Steven Pinker saw a long-term historical decline in war and homicide rates. Now, they're right with some qualifications about homicide rates, but not about war. And I am going to especially take on Pinker's historical statistics, because he obviously has a little research team and he's produced a lot of data on wars. I'm going to skip over this. I'm not going to talk about early human warfare. They argue that that hunter-gatherers were extremely warlike. This is very controversial. It's very difficult to be certain. The data are weak and conflicting, and so I'll leave that open. Now, the core of Pinker's data is his quantification of war deaths, war fatalities. Okay? Now let me explain this table. These are the cases of the worst cases of the number of deaths caused by wars. The first column is the war itself. WW2 obviously means World War II. And then the century in which they happened, the absolute number of deaths, and I'll stop there for the moment. In terms of the absolute number of deaths, you can see that it's actually World War II and the failed Great Leap Forward of Mao that produced the highest number of fatalities. Now then there come two cases there, the Mongols and An Lushan, where I'm afraid he produces extraordinarily exaggerated statistics. And for the Mongols, he gives a number of 40 million, whereas scholars say it's about 11.5 million. Now, obviously, that's bad enough, but it doesn't put the Mongols at number 3, okay? There's a tendency to exaggerate the atrocities of groups in ancient history like the Assyrians or like the Mongols in the kind of medieval history. And the examples where they destroy a city and kill all of the population is taken to be their typical strategy. Whereas what it was is when they invade an area and they come across a city, and if that city resists them, then they will eventually seize the city and kill most of the inhabitants. But they do that as a form of exemplary repression in order to persuade other cities to surrender to them. And it generally works. You don't want the fate of that earlier city. And so we have a much lower rate of casualties than he says. And Lushan, the next one down, is a Chinese civil war in the 8th century. And again, he exaggerates the death. At 36 million, it's only 13. Well, you can see that in absolute deaths, the 20th century is going to turn out to be, the first half of the 20th century is going to turn out to be the bloodiest. So that wouldn't square with a notion of wars declining in human history. However, Pinker then introduces an interesting qualification, the relative deaths. Now, the relative deaths is the number of deaths as a proportion of the population of the world at that time. Okay? And so if you do that, and remember the enormous increase in modern populations, you're going to get the relative death rate of modern cases declining considerably. Okay, now it's a meaningful statistic. But I think then that what I have sought to do is to add another index, which is the duration of wars, how long they last. Because after all, World War II only lasts 8 years, counting the beginning as the Japanese invasion of China, whereas the Mongols' conquest lasted for just over 100 years, and the slave trades lasted for much longer than that. So the annual death rate is, I calculated that, and then you get the annual revised rank, and you can see number 1 is World War II, number 2 is World War I, number 3 the Taiping Rebellion, which is the 19th century, etc. Now there's another point to make here, which is that Pinker separates the 20th century killings into 6 separate cases. Now I have to explain one thing here, that in order to be able to fit these cases onto a screen which you could read, I reduced it down to 14. He gives 21, and I've done all the calculations on 21. And what we find there is that there are 6 different cases of the first half of the 20th century. World War I, World War II, the Russian and Chinese civil wars, Stalin's killings, and the killings of Mao's famines. And of course, they were all within 50 years of each other, and they're all connected. That is, well, obviously, without World War I, no Russian Civil War, I made that argument. Without World War I, no World War II, etc., etc. So there's no gainsaying the fact that the first half of the 20th century is the bloodiest period ever in human history, which is impossible to square with a notion of a decline in war. And now these are the other arguments I've just been making. The conclusion is there's been some variability through human history, but no overall decline, and in fact the highest peak is in the 20th century. I won't deal with homicide. So, a lot of their argument depends upon the period after 1945, because the 20th century, in terms of interstate wars, has seen the biggest disjunction between the first half and the second half. Obviously, since 1945, there's a big reduction in interstate wars. And it's interstate wars that have been most of those worst historical cases, not all of them. And we can see that in the West, in Western countries, war is no longer what it was for centuries, the backbone of the state, the heart of the state. Okay? And we have relatively pacific domestic societies in Germany, in France, in Britain, even the United States. There are various causes of this, of course, and one of them is that the Europeans eventually destroyed themselves, killing 90 million Europeans in the course of the 20th century. There was a kind of, put it mildly, war weariness. And whereas for the millennium before then, Europeans had been extremely warlike, from about 1000 AD to well, to 1945, Europe had probably been the longest civilization in the world to have fought so many wars and so many on such a continuous basis. Right? People have tried to get the statistics of comparison, and the only ones that seem comparable at all is ancient China in the period of two periods that are called the Spring and Autumn period and the Warring States period. And that's from about 700 BC to 200 AD. And that's virtually a millennium as well. That's a comparison with Europe, but the only one that can really be made. But now, suddenly, Europeans, instead of being from Mars, are from Venus. Right. It's all about love. There's also the end of empires. And Andreas Wimmer has shown that modern wars outside of the world wars, the smaller wars, have essentially been about the end of empires. Colonial, first of all, colonial conquests, and then post-colonial movements, anti-colonial movements. The end of empires, except, of course, for the United States. Then, as a further cause, we've had mutually assured destruction, MAD in English, the nuclear confrontation, which was certainly very disciplining of the two-power confrontations, not only the United States and the Soviet Union, but also India and Pakistan, that having these weapons and the possibility of mutually assured destruction disciplines those countries away from actually going to war with each other. So the United States and the Soviet Union went to great lengths to make sure that their troops never encountered each other. You could fight through proxies in Vietnam or in Angola, Namibia, all over the world, with the use of Cuban troops by the Soviet Union and the covert organizing of foreign regimes and right-wing oppositions by the United States. You also have a high degree of international regulation of the nation-state system, especially the case in Africa and LA. Doesn't mean Los Angeles, it means Latin America. Where in Latin America, people have shown, political scientists have shown, that the typical outbreak of hostilities is not what they call a war, but a militarized interstate dispute, where a few soldiers have a go at each other or the threats are made, and then the two sides are calmed down by international regulation. They take the dispute to some international body, the Pope, the King or Queen of England in two cases, and the various international Latin American institutions themselves. So this is all about the decline of war in this period, interstate war. But of course, there's been a rise in civil wars, which started in the 1930s and then became even greater after World War II, lasted until the mid-1990s, the last batch being partly the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and then a slight decline, in which period these writers are writing. And one thing I always say is that sociologists have to be wary of the sociology of the last 5 minutes, you know, looking at the right now contemporary trends being the future of the world. Because there's been a growth again from 2010 in civil wars, and so far 2017 is the worst case for the number of fatalities, especially of civilians, because these civil wars tend to kill more civilians than soldiers. And refugees. 2017 saw more refugees, political refugees, in the world than in any known previous year. Now, of course, one can relate to that, and people do, by saying, yes, but these civil wars are all in the south of the world, the global south. They're in poorer countries. They're a long way from us. They have to do with the problems of poor countries trying to establish nation states, whose nation state it is, etc. And so it doesn't have very much to do with us. But this shows that it does. These are recent civil wars, or occasionally interstate wars, but usually civil wars, and who gets involved in them. And we call them civil wars. We say there's a civil war going on in the Yemen right now. But actually, there's about 9 powers involved in that Yemeni Civil War. In Mali and Chad, there's a great deal of French intervention. There are about 3,500 French troops stationed in West Africa, intervening in the civil wars there, supporting one side or the other, and they get US logistical support. Somalia is the US and African Union states, Colombia, the US, Afghanistan and northern Pakistan, US plus most of NATO, and including, of course, Germany. Syria, Libya, the Yemen, and then the eastern Ukraine. There's also foreign intervention against armed religious groups, obviously, with Al-Qaeda and Daesh, ISIS, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. And these movements themselves are transnational, operating right across the borders. So the point I would make from this is we are involved in these wars around the world. Now, we're involved in an indirect way. Oh, sorry, this is the deployment of the French. We're involved in an indirect way. We're not directly involved. Our young men are not being conscripted into fighting in these wars as they were in the first half of the 20th century in interstate wars. Randall Collins, the sociologist, has made a very interesting distinction between ferocious and callous killing. Ferocious killing is the historical norm where you're trying to plunge sharp weapons into the body of another human being, and where it's ferocious. Ferocity was a prized social virtue. Young men were trained to be ferocious, and it's bloody, it's body parts, it's mutilation of human beings as well as killing. But now, though there is some of this in the world, I mean, especially with groups like Daesh, ISIS, the killing has become more long distance. There was the growth of artillery in the modern period, and now long-range bombing, and finally drones. Now, this is not about hacking at someone else's body. This is about killing and mutilating people from a distance, from a long distance, typically victims that you don't actually see that you're the killer. And furthermore, your soldiers are not at risk. The extreme of this is drone warfare, of course, where people sitting at computer terminals in Kansas or in Lincolnshire in England are playing what looks like a kind of computer simulation game, but with the consequence that drones are killing large numbers of people a long way away. Now, there has been one casualty among drone operators. In his excitement, one man fell off his chair and broke his arm. Apart from that, it's not a dangerous occupation at all. And it's another sign of removing the nature of war from our own society, our own soldiers. Okay? The United States has another way of reducing its armed forces casualties. It's by subcontracting activity out to private organizations who typically in the Middle East, they employ people from the Middle East. And typically the victims that are killed in these disputes are those people from the Middle East who are employed by military contractors who are subcontracted from the US government. So there's a whole series of things going on which remove war from our society, but doesn't remove war from our practice. When the Falklands Malvinas War was going on in 1982, a very short war, I coined the term of spectator sport militarism, because I was in Britain at that time and our media were full of the success of this war, the ongoing war, the danger involved. Of course, it was a world away. I mean, literally in the Falkland Isles or the Malvinas Isles going to Argentina. And so we were engaging in it as spectators. That's the most that British society was doing. Indeed, that tends to happen when the war seems to be going successfully, as in that case, or as in the war in Iraq for the first year. And then after that, when it's clear that the war is not going successfully, there are various ways of removing it from public consciousness. One is having a ban on ceremonial reception of corpses back in the United States, which happened in earlier wars, and now they are ignored, they're brought back quietly. There's no public commemoration of these dead soldiers. So this dichotomy between the lack of war impacting on our own Western society and our involvement in wars abroad produces the reason why liberals think war has declined and why many people think that war has declined, because it's not really being done by us in a direct way. Now, it's not only military interventions, it's of course the massive arms sales that just about all Western countries, including Germany, are involved in, making a kind of substantial profit out of these civil wars. It's about proxy wars, and it's about small, under-publicized interventions abroad. Oh, well, this is something that just shows the the proportion of civilian deaths. And the final column is the percentage of all deaths caused in battle. And you can see how small these percentages are, meaning that the vast majority of people killed are who we would call civilians. And that's in these recent wars which we're involved in. I want to dwell for a moment on the Yemeni Civil War going on at present. What has been happening is that the US, having done a deal with Saudi Arabia in 1946 about supplying Saudi Arabia with defense forces in return for oil, that alliance that still exists between the United States and Saudi Arabia has gone to the point where the United States and NATO is involved in a Shia versus Sunni civil war across the Middle East. And we are supporting the Sunni against the Shia. The exception to this is, of course, Daesh, which is also Sunni. But Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states involved, along with it in the Yemen, are Sunni states. The Yemeni government at present, the Houthis are Shia. They're being aided by Iran, by Hezbollah. These are the Shia organizations. And we are involved in this civil war in which we have no interest. If one thinks about it, why does the United States support Saudi Arabia rather than Iran? Iran is the more democratic. I mean, I know it's a long way short of a perfect democracy, but they have elections, and there is some, and there are, demonstrations in the street and the like. Whereas Saudi Arabia, there's nothing. Now, okay, Saudi Arabia has a little more oil than Iran. Not much more, but it does have more oil. But on the other hand, the United States has become less dependent on foreign oil because of what fracking has revealed, that the United States is now largely self-sufficient in terms of energy. So I can see no good reason why the United States is involved in this war at all, and why, in consequence of this, so in more minor ways are most of the NATO countries. I think that the kind of history plays a major role, and that it's difficult to rid oneself from the alliances one's had in the past, and to make, and hostilities as well. But it proves again how foreign policy and wars are by no means rational. They contain very strongly irrational elements. Well, that's showing that things are fairly flat recently, but the trend is now up again. World military expenditure gone up since 2000. So these are the things that I've been emphasizing. So what I've shown, I hope, is no long-term decline in interstate wars until suddenly a short-term decline from 1945 onwards, but replaced by a rising number of civil wars, which are, however, mostly internationalized, and which are involving the countries that we tend to think of now as being Pacific. The civilian deaths as a proportion of total deaths has been going steadily up in the 20th and 21st century. Now, what about the future? Well, nobody can predict the future, but it's highly likely that the Middle East will remain a highly war-riven place especially since there seems to be no desire by either the United States or Russia or anyone else to stop interfering in it. But then the two kind of really, well, there are three possible scenarios, and all one can say is that they are possible. In the first place, the confrontation in East Asia between China and the United States. China obviously is being more expansive with building militarized little islands and things in the Pacific, and the United States is very reluctant to give way. Could that build it up into a war? Well, it's perfectly possible. They are both nuclear powers, and so if it did, that would be the end of human society. But I think, well, it's dangerous, that's the most one could say. And then there's the two other possibilities of nuclear war in general and environmental wars. And environmental wars are definitely a possibility the way things are going at the present, in that humanity is failing to deal with climate change, and things are going to get worse and worse, and there's going to be massive refugee flows and tendencies to build up by countries that are relatively well situated will build fortress walls around themselves, and it's definitely a context likely to produce wars. So I think finally, Pinker and his co-liberals were mostly wrong, and Kant's perpetual peace is not much nearer. It still remains an aspiration. War has not been abolished and is currently getting worse. Thank you.